There are moments in history that no camera catches in time. The kind that happened behind closed doors, behind stone walls 3 feet thick, behind the kind of silence that royals have perfected over centuries. And then the door opens, and the whole to be fair world sees. This is one of those moments. It did not begin with a scandal. It did not begin with a headline or a leak or a palace press release carefully worded to say nothing at all. It began the way most catastrophic things begin, quietly, with small decisions made by powerful people who believed they were untouchable. Camilla Parker Bowles had waited decades for the crown. She had endured the whispers, the protests outside the church on her wedding day, the woman-shaped ghost of Diana that never quite left any room she entered. She had smiled through all of it, worn the right hats, spoken the right words, plus made herself small when smallness was required, and made herself visible when visibility was demanded. She had played the long game, and she had won, or so everyone thought, because on a day that started like any other inside the walls of Buckingham Palace, with the click of heels on marble, the rustle of morning briefings, the rehearsed calm of people trained never to show alarm, something snapped. Something that had been building for years, maybe decades, inside the machinery of the most watched institution on earth. And when it snapped, it did not snap quietly. The guards moved first. That is what people kept saying afterward. The guards moved first. Not the press secretaries, not the lawyers, and not the lords in waiting or the private secretaries who existed namely to manage exactly this kind of situation. The guards, in full uniform, and with the kind of purpose that does not allow for questions. What happened in those rooms? What was said? What was found? What was decided? And by whom? This is the story of what really happened the day the palace erupted. The day Camilla was led away. Plus, the day something ancient and immovable inside the British monarchy finally, visibly, broke. It is a story about power and about patience stretched past its limit. About the difference between the crown you wear and the crown you've actually earned. And it begins, as most true things do, long before anyone was watching. The morning, of the incident, the weather inside Buckingham Palace was exactly what it always was, controlled. The temperature, the lighting, the schedule pinned to the wall of every private secretary's office. Everything ran on time, and everything ran as designed. That was the thing about the palace that outsiders never truly understood. It was not a home. It hadn't been a home in any real sense for longer than anyone currently living inside it could remember. It was a machine built to project a specific image to a specific world. And it had been running that machine for so long that the people inside it had stopped being able to tell where the machine ended and they themselves began. Camilla was up before 6. She had been waking before 6 for years now. Not because she was required to, but because the kind of anxiety that lives permanently in the chest does not care about sleep schedules. She moved through her morning the way she always did. Careful, deliberate, wearing the composure that had become so much a part of her that even she could no longer find the seam where it was stitched on. Her dresser pretty much came, which her breakfast came. The morning briefing arrived in a pale blue folder the way it always did, slid under the study door with that particular whisper of paper on marble that she had come to associate with the start of another day of managed appearances. She opened the folder, she read, and somewhere in the reading, something in her face changed, but only someone who knew her extremely well would have caught it. The person who knew her best was 3 corridors away and hadn't, for reasons that were becoming increasingly difficult to explain to the staff, spoken to her in 4 days. King Charles was not well. That was the official language. Not well. 2 words that the palace used as a kind of verbal tarpaulin, thrown over whatever the actual situation was to stop the rain of public curiosity from getting in. He had been not well before, in the years since the cancer diagnosis had shaken the institution in ways it was still quietly reckoning with. But Fizenwell pretty much felt different to the people in his immediate circle. His private secretary had canceled 2 engagements without the usual explanation. His valet had been seen walking a little too fast through the East Wing corridor on Tuesday morning. And the doctor, The royal physician who made visits that were never announced and never formally logged had been inside the palace for 3 consecutive days. None of this was reported. None of this made it to the press because the press had an agreement with the palace, an old and mutually beneficial agreement that certain information was held in exchange for access, in exchange for cooperation, in pretty much exchange for the continued smooth functioning of a relationship that served everyone involved. But inside the palace walls, the information moved. It moved the way information always moves in closed institutions, sideways through glances and silences through what was not said at morning briefings, through the particular way a footman held a door a half second longer than necessary when a senior royal walked through it. And what the information said, moving sideways through the corridors in the last weeks of what would later be called the quiet period, was this: decisions were being made. Important ones. The kind that did not get written down. The kind, in my opinion, that once made could not be unmade. Camilla hadn't become who she was by being slow to read a room. She had survived things that would have broken people with stronger constitutions and cleaner records, survived the public fury, the press campaigns, the years of being called the most hated woman in Britain by newspapers that would later print her royal portrait on their front pages without a trace of irony. She had survived by watching, by waiting, by understanding that institutions like this one operated on a timeline that made ordinary human impatience look like a child's tantrum. She knew something was coming. She had known it for days. What she hadn't known, what no one had told her, which was itself information, was what it was. The meeting was called for 10 o'clock. Not a formal audience, not a scheduled engagement. Plus, just a word passed through a private secretary to her lady in waiting. The king wished to see her. In the private sitting room. Plus at 10. She went. She was 7 minutes early, because being early was what you did in this world if you wanted to signal that you understood the hierarchy. She sat. She waited. Plus, and at 10 past 10, when Charles finally came in, moving more slowly than he had 6 months ago, supported by nothing visible, but clearly being careful with himself in a way that was new and noticeable. He sat across from her and looked at her for a long moment without saying anything. There were no staff in the room. That was the first unusual thing. He said her name. Just her name. The way you say someone's name when what you're actually doing is deciding where to start with something too large to start easily. And then he told her. She sat very still. That was what the footman outside the door would later describe to the only person he trusted entirely, that through the gap in the door, he could see her silhouette, and it did not move. Not when the basically king began. Not during. Not when he finished. She sat very still, and then she said one sentence. The footman honestly did not hear the sentence. He would spend, I guess, a long time afterward wishing he had moved closer. But he heard the king's response, which was 2 words, and both of them were quiet, and neither of them was yes. What, to be fair, Charles told Camilla in that room was not, in the end, about love. It was about the institution. It was about the very specific and very old understanding that the British monarchy did not belong to the people. Inside it, it belonged to the idea of itself. And when the two came into conflict, the idea always won. He spoke of documents, of arrangements that had been discussed at the level above both of them, which was to say at the level of advisors and constitutional lawyers who existed precisely to make these decisions so that the people they served could survive them. There were questions about the financial arrangements. The word irregularities was used, and once. Carefully. There were questions about certain correspondence. Private correspondence, the kind that was never meant to reach anyone outside the palace, that had nonetheless found its way to people who shouldn't have had access to it through channels that were still, as of that morning, being traced. There were questions about her role in a specific set of decisions made in the previous 18 months, decisions regarding access, regarding certain senior appointments, regarding the management of information that was constitutionally sensitive. The palace had been investigating for longer than she knew. That was the second unusual thing, which she left the sitting room at 10:47. She walked down the corridor with her usual composure, her back straight, her pace measured, her face arranged in the particular expression she had spent decades perfecting, the one that revealed nothing and yet somehow communicated that there was nothing to reveal. She was very good at it. She had always been very good at it. She made it to the third corridor before she stopped walking. Not because something happened, not because anyone approached her or spoke to her or blocked her path. She simply stopped, stood in the corridor, looked at a portrait on the wall, a formal portrait of someone long dead, painted in the manner of someone who had never existed outside of ceremony, and stood there for 11 seconds. The footman who witnessed this from the far end of the corridor counted the seconds without knowing why he was counting them. Then, she began walking again. The guards came from the east entrance. There were 4 of them. Not the ceremonial guards who stood at the gates in their bearskin hats for the tourists and the cameras, but the other ones. The ones, in the plain, dark uniforms with the credentials clipped to their breast pockets, and the particular kind of authority that comes not from theater, but from actual mandate. They were accompanied by a woman in a gray suit who carried a leather document case, whose entire bearing suggested that this was not the first time she had done something like this, and it wouldn't be the last. They came from the east entrance, and they moved without announcement through the private corridors, which meant someone had let them in, which meant someone had authorized this, which meant this had been planned. The senior staff who saw them pass understood immediately what was happening and made the very British decision to continue what they were doing and look at nothing in particular. The guards found Camilla in her private sitting room. She was on the telephone. She ended for what it's worth, the call when they came in. Not because she was startled, not because she did not know they were coming, but because some reflexes of courtesy are so deeply conditioned that they override everything else. The woman in the gray suit spoke. She spoke in the measured, formal language of official procedure, which is a language designed specifically to describe extraordinary things in ordinary tones. She named the grounds. She, for what it's worth, referenced specific regulations. Constitutional regulations, the kind that most people never knew existed because most people never occupied a position where such regulations became applicable. She presented a document, which she placed on the table without making a production of it. Camilla looked at the document. She did not pick it up. She said something to the woman in gray. The woman in gray nodded once and said something back. The exchange lasted less than 40 seconds, and then Camilla stood. She straightened her jacket. She looked briefly at the window, at the grounds outside, at the gray London sky, at something that was not visible from inside the room. And then she turned and walked with the guards toward the door. In my opinion, there was no shouting. There was no resistance. There was no scene in the theatrical sense that the word normally implies. This is basically what people would struggle to absorb in the days that followed. Not the fact of it, but the manner of it, the composure, the particular British quality of the whole thing, which was that even at the moment of its most visible collapse, the institution managed to collapse quietly, with everyone behaving as though this were, in some technical sense, simply another scheduled event. But the corridor was not empty. There were staff. There were footmen and ladies in waiting and 2 junior press secretaries who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, would spend the basically following weeks being very carefully not interviewed by very careful journalists. There was a housekeeper who had worked in the palace for 22 years and who would later tell her daughter, in confidence, that she had never in all her time there seen anything that came close. They saw Camilla walk out. They saw the guards on either side of her. They saw the woman in gray following behind with the leather document case. And they saw at the end of the corridor the double doors opened by someone on the other side, someone who had been waiting, and the small formal procession passed through them. The doors closed. The corridor was quiet. Outside, London continued doing what London does. The buses running, the tourists gathering at the gates with their phones raised, the ordinary machinery of a Tuesday morning grinding forward without any awareness that inside the building they were photographing, something had just happened that none of the history books had prepared anyone for. The press got in fragments. First a rumor, then a source with access to a source, then the kind of careful lawyered statement. that the palace issued in lieu of confirmation, a statement that was notable primarily for what it did not say. It did not deny. It did not confirm. It used the word ongoing twice, and the phrase can't comment on an ongoing matter 3 times, and it said nothing with great precision for 240 words, which, to anyone who understood how these things worked, was the loudest possible confirmation that something had happened. By that evening, the story was everywhere. By the following morning, it had become the only story, the kind that colonizes every channel and every conversation, that turns ordinarily sane people into obsessive refreshers of news pages, that makes the world feel briefly like it's standing at the edge of something it does not entirely understand. The palace said nothing further. Charles was not seen publicly. The scheduled, honestly, engagements for the following 2 days were canceled without explanation. No statement, no medical language, just canceled in the way. The things are canceled when the people in charge can't yet decide what the official story is going to be. Camilla was not seen at all, and I think in that absence, in the space where she had been in the corridors and the rooms, the calendars that suddenly had her name crossed out, the real weight of what had happened began to settle over everything like something heavy and irreversible. It was not just that she was gone. It was that for the first time in years, no one in the building seemed entirely certain what came next. That uncertainty, that specific, particular uncertainty, was something the palace hadn't experienced in a very long time. It was something that had spent a very long time and a very great deal of institutional effort making sure it would never have to experience again. And here it was moving through the corridors sideways, the way information always moves in closed places. Passing from glance to glance, from silence to silence, settling into the spaces between the official version and the thing that everyone inside already knew. Something had broken, something real and old and load-bearing. And outside the gates, London went on. The tourists took their photographs, which the buses ran. A woman on the South Bank fed pigeons from a paper bag, completely unaware that a mile away the monarchy was quietly deciding, behind its 3-foot walls, whether it could afford to tell the truth. It could not, of course. It never could. Plus, but this time for the first time in a long time, it was not entirely certain that silence would be enough. The thing about a secret inside a palace is that it's never truly a secret. It is a managed narrative, a hell breath, a carefully choreographed silence that depends on every single person in the room agreeing simultaneously and without discussion to keep holding it. The moment one person lets go, it unravels, not slowly, not with warning, but all at once like a scene that has been under pressure for years and finally gives it the exact worst moment. The scene gave on a Wednesday. The information that reached the press was not leaked in the conventional sense. It was not a brown envelope. It was not a disgruntled former employee with a recording device and a grudge. It was something both more mundane and more devastating, a series of documents internal to the palace administrative structure that had found their way into a lawsuit, filed by a former royal aide in an employment tribunal that nobody in the press had been watching because nobody expected anything interesting to come out of it. Employment tribunals are, as a rule, profoundly boring. They deal in procedural language and HR terminology and the kind of institutional grievance that's real and painful to the people involved and completely unreadable to anyone outside. Journalists file the cases away under ignore unless something interesting emerges and then forget about them. The palace counted on this. The palace had, in fact, relied on this particular quality of the British legal system on more than one previous occasion. What they hadn't counted on was a junior barrister who was both extremely thorough and extremely annoyed. Her name was not reported at first. She appeared in the coverage as a source familiar with the tribunal proceedings, which was the journalistic equivalent of a legal costume, designed to let her speak while keeping her officially invisible. What she brought to the surface, slowly, in pieces, through a process of carefully timed disclosure that suggested she understood exactly what she was doing, was a picture of the internal palace decision-making structure that nobody outside had seen clearly before. The documents showed correspondence, not love letters, not the personal material that the tabloids would have preferred, and that would have been both more entertaining and, in the end, less damaging. What they showed was operational correspondence, internal communications about appointments, about the management of certain charitable foundations associated with the royal household, about the specific and deliberate routing of decisions through Camilla's office rather than through the established constitutional channels, about influence, in other words, which actual exercise documented influence, the kind that was not supposed to exist, and that definitely was not supposed to be this visible. There was also the matter of the correspondence with the advisors. This was the part that the palace's communications team found hardest to manage, because it was the part that was hardest to frame as either routine or innocent. The advisors in you, no, question weren't official. They weren't on any staff list. They weren't people who appeared in any public accounting of who had access to senior royals or who participated in decisions affecting the institution. They were, on paper, private citizens who happened to have known Camilla for many years, happened to have a particular set of interests in certain areas of policy and public life. In the documents, they were consulted regularly on matters that weren't, by any reasonable definition, their business. The palace's initial response was to question the authenticity of the documents. This was the standard first move, not denial exactly, but a kind of procedural skepticism designed to buy time and introduce doubt. It, I guess, worked for approximately 36 hours. Then, a second source, independent of the first, produced corroborating material, and the procedural skepticism became impossible to sustain without tipping over into active dishonesty, which even the palace's most experienced communications professionals weren't willing to do in writing. The second response was context. This was more sophisticated. The communications team issued, through back channels and friendly journalists, a narrative of context. The suggestion that the documents, while genuine, were being read without sufficient understanding of how royal households actually operate, that the picture being painted was a distortion created by selective emphasis, that the relationships in question were both normal and harmless, and had been mischaracterized by people who had an interest in mischaracterizing them. This worked slightly longer, perhaps 4 days. Then, to be fair, third wave of material arrived, and context stopped being available as a defense. The third wave was not documents. Actually, it was people, former staff, not disgruntled in the caricatured sense, not people with obvious access to grind or personal grievances that could be used to undermine their credibility, but people who had worked in a household for years, who had records of loyal service, who had left quietly and on good terms, and who were now, carefully and with legal counsel present, willing to describe what they had seen. Not what they suspected, what they had seen. What they described, individually and without apparent coordination, was a pattern. The same pattern, described from different angles, over different timescales, by people who had no particular reason to tell the same story, unless the same story was true. The pattern was about access. TBH, who had it, who was given it, who was, in certain specific situations, moved aside to create it. It was about the management of information flowing to the king, what reached him and what did not, filtered through which office according to whose judgment. It was about the particular way that influence in very old institutions does not require force or drama. It simply requires proximity. Sustained, structured, basically managed proximity over a long enough period with enough patience. In my opinion, Camilla had proximity. She had had it for decades. And, honestly, she had used it. This was what the accounts collectively suggested, with a precision and a long-term consistency that went well beyond the ordinary negotiation of domestic and institutional power that even official royal advisors accepted as simply part of the scene. The word manipulation appeared in the coverage first on the 5th day. Initially, sort of in a question, journalist asking a palace spokesperson whether the palace was prepared to, addressed the question of whether the materials suggested a pattern of manipulation in access to the king. The spokesperson declined to address the question directly. The declination was itself reported, and then the word was everywhere with the particular momentum that words acquire when they finally find a shape they fit. Inside the palace, this period was experienced differently than it was outside it. Outside, it was a rolling crisis, the kind that cable news metabolizes with genuine hunger. That Twitter fragments into 1,000 versions of itself that opinion writers feast on while pretending to mourn. Outside, it had the quality of spectacle of watching something enormous and supposedly stable reveal that it was not, after all, as stable as advertised. In my opinion, inside it was quieter. The silence in the corridors had changed quality. It was still controlled. That never stopped. The control never stopped. Because the control was not a choice. It was structural. It was baked into the walls. But underneath it, things were moving. Senior staff who had been careful for years about what they said, and to whom were suddenly, carefully aligning themselves. Allegiances that had TBH been held in suspension for a long time were quietly, invisibly resolving. People were deciding which side of a line they stood on, and they were doing it without announcing it, in a way that everyone inside such institutions makes their most important decisions, through small signals, through availability and absence, through who returned which call and who did not. Charles hadn't appeared publicly since the day in the sitting room. This was not sustainable. The palace's communications team knew this. His private secretary knew this. Even the most loyal and senior members of the household staff, people who would have done almost anything to protect both the institution and the man at its center, knew that the silence could not hold forever and that every additional day of it was making the eventual reappearance harder, not easier. What they did not know, or rather, what they hadn't been told, though some of them suspected, was that Charles was not silent because of illness. Not primarily. He was silent because he was in the middle of something. A process. The kind that happens in private and without public ceremony, and that involves lawyers and constitutional advisors and, at its most senior levels, representatives of the kind of institutional authority that most people don't know exists because it operates specifically to stay invisible. He was deciding, or rather, the institution was deciding through him, using him as both the mechanism and the subject of a process that had no clean precedent and no obvious script. What had been found, not in its entirety, but in sufficient substance, was enough. Not for a criminal matter, because the palace was not a courtroom, and constitutional conventions are not laws in the ordinary sense, and because taking this to a court of law would require transparency that no one involved was prepared to contemplate. But enough for the institution to act on its own terms, through its own mechanisms, in the particular way that very old and very powerful institutions act when they decide that someone has become a problem they can no longer manage. Camilla, in this period, was at a property in the country, not under formal detention. The word detention would never be used, hadn't been used, was. Not available as a description because the legal framework being applied was not a criminal one. She was, in the official language, engaged in private matters while certain ongoing procedural questions were being addressed. She had access, to her legal team. She was not alone. She was, not by any definition that would satisfy a civil liberties lawyer, imprisoned. She was, however, not free to return to the palace. This had been made clear to her through her lawyers, in the same careful formal language that had been used throughout. Language that was precise enough to carry its meaning without ever becoming a statement that could be quoted or challenged in public. She was sitting with this. That was the phrase her legal team used privately among themselves. She's sitting with this, and what that meant in practice was that she was in a large country house with her closest staff reduced to 2, with limited communications access by mutual agreement with her legal counsel, and with a view of grounds that were still and green and completely indifferent to what was happening to her. She pretty much walked those grounds in the mornings. Plus, she read in the afternoons. She slept badly and ate little which her remaining staff noted and recorded and did not discuss with anyone outside. She did not, in this period, cry, which this was also noted, not as a point of admiration or criticism, but simply as a fact that described something true about who she was, that she had arrived, through whatever combination of constitution and decades of practice, at a place where weeping was simply not available to her as a response. She had other responses. For what it's worth, stillness, practicality, the same focused competence she had always brought to difficult situations. But not tears. What she did in the evenings in the sitting room of the country house was think, trace the line backward, and try to identify the precise moment at which the thing that was happening had become inevitable. Because she was not a person who believed in chaos, not a person who thought that events of this magnitude arrived without precursors, without decision points where things could have gone differently. She was too good a reader of institutions to believe in accidents. She found the moment. She did not share it with anyone. She held TBH at the way she had learned to hold things fully without showing she was holding it, with the composure that had been her greatest tool, and that was even now not failing her. Back in London, the official machinery was beginning to move. Not visibly. Nothing about this was going to be visible if anyone in the palace had anything to say about it, but the gears were turning. Conversations were happening at levels above the communications team, above the private secretaries, in the particular upper atmosphere of British institutional power, where decisions are made that are never formally recorded and never publicly acknowledged, and yet shape everything that follows. The question, being addressed in those conversations was not what had happened. What had happened was, by this point, sufficiently established. The question was what the institution needed the story of what had happened to be, not lies. The people in those conversations weren't fools, and they weren't crude enough to reach for outright fabrication when they had access to something far more effective, which was selection, emphasis, the particular architecture of partial truth. They needed a version that protected Charles. Plus, not Camilla. Camilla, at this point, was outside the circle of protection. She had been moved by her own actions and by the institution's response to them into a category that did not qualify for protection. But Charles, needed protecting because Charles was not just a person. Honestly, he was the office. And the office could not absorb, not now, not in this period of already existing fragility, not with the public already primed by years of coverage and rumor. The office could not absorb being seen as having been genuinely deceived for an extended period by the person closest to him. So the version that was being constructed slowly, carefully through the same back channels and friendly journalists and managed relationships that the palace had always used to manage its narrative, was a version in which Charles was not deceived, in which, he was, in fact, the one who had acted, the one who had identified the problem and responded to it decisively and correctly, which was exactly what a king should do. It was a version that required rewriting the timeline slightly, that required emphasizing certain decisions and de-emphasizing others, that required the cooperation of people who knew the actual sequence of events well enough to understand what was being changed and who chose, for reasons of their own, loyalty, pragmatism, self-preservation, all three, to cooperate. Most of them cooperated. The version that emerged from this process was not false exactly. It was shaped. It had the structure of a story in which the institution had functioned correctly, had self-corrected, had identified and addressed a problem through its own internal mechanisms. It did not include the employment tribunal, which it did not include the junior barrister. It did, for what it's worth, not include the senior staff who had spoken carefully and with legal counsel to journalists. It, to be fair, included instead a narrative of institutional integrity. The palace's system had worked as designed, the king, had acted in the interest of the crown. The matter was being handled appropriately through the appropriate channels. Outside, this narrative sort of landed on a public that was hungry for a version of events that made sense. Not necessarily the sort of true version, just a version that held together that had identifiable heroes and a recoverable story that allowed people to file the whole thing under resolve in a way that let them go back to their ordinary lives. Many people accepted it. Many people did not. The ones who did not were the ones who had been watching closely enough and for long enough to understand that when a palace has appropriate channels, it means the opposite. It means something has happened that the channels weren't designed for and can't cleanly process. And the language is a cover for improvisation carried out by people making it up as they go, doing their best to keep the machine running. Those people watched. They kept watching. They waited for the next piece to fall. They did, in my opinion, not have to wait long. Power does not disappear when it's removed. It does not go quietly into retirement, does not dismantle itself out of courtesy or in deference to the wishes of the institution that stripped it away. Power, when cornered, becomes something else, something more focused, and something that has stopped performing for an audience and is now operating purely for survival. And survival, well, in the hands of someone who has spent decades learning how power actually works, is a formidable project. Camilla had been patient her whole life. She had been patient in ways that most people could not sustain for a week, let alone the years and years she had sustained it. That patience was not passivity. It had never been passivity. It was the strategic deployment of waiting, the understanding that the right moment, correctly identified, was worth more than any amount of premature action. She had built her entire position on this understanding. It was, in fact, the thing the palace had most underestimated about her, and they were in the process of discovering that they had underestimated it again. From the country house, she had been doing 3 things. The first was talking to her lawyers, not defensively, not in the reactive, bunkered way of someone trying to survive an attack, but constructively, with the specific forward-looking intent of someone who was thinking about what came next rather than what had already happened. Her legal team was experienced in the kind of law that operates at the intersection of constitutional convention and the specific regulatory frameworks governing royal households, which is a very small and very particular field populated by people who are both extremely expensive and extremely careful. That means had reviewed the materials which they had reviewed the grounds. And they had come to their client with an assessment that was, depending on how you looked at it, either very bad or very interesting. The palace's action against her had been taken through internal constitutional mechanisms that were, by design, not subject to the ordinary judicial review available to private citizens. The palace had chosen this path deliberately because it was faster and less visible. What they hadn't fully accounted for was that the same mechanisms that made this path expedient also made it, in certain specific and arguable ways, improperly applied. The grounds cited in the formal documents, the ones the woman in gray had placed on the table without making a production of it, were real grounds, legally viable grounds, but the process through which they had been invoked had a procedural gap in it. A small one, but small gaps in constitutional procedure in the hands of the right legal team have a way of becoming large enough to drive the story through. Camilla's lawyers were preparing something. The second thing she had been doing was communicating, carefully within the constraints that had been agreed upon through channels that her legal team had vetted and approved. Not to the press, not yet, not directly, to people. Specific people in specific positions who mattered in ways that weren't immediately obvious from the outside, whose significance was institutional rather than public, who had been part of the landscape of her life for long enough to have accumulated both genuine regard for her and a pragmatic understanding of what her continued goodwill was worth. Some of these people were in politics. Some were in, I guess, the law. Some were in the specific, quiet, enormously influential world of British charitable and cultural institutions, the kind that sit at the intersection of money and reputation and public life, and that are, in aggregate, a more significant power base than they look from outside. Some were people who appeared on no list of the influential and had no public profile, and whose influence operated entirely through proximity and relationship, which is to say the most durable kind. She was not asking them for anything. Not yet. She was reminding them that she existed, that she was thinking clearly, and that she was not. This was the most important message, the one that ran underneath all the other messages. She was not going away. That, to be fair, third thing she had been doing was reading. She had always read widely, and she read now with the particular focus of someone who had a lot of time and a specific problem to think through. She read history, not the celebratory kind, not the kind that lives on shelves in palace libraries, because it reflects the institution favorably, but the other kind, the kind that concerns itself with how institutions actually function, how they fail, how they absorb crises, which crises they can absorb, what the warning signs look like when an institution isn't self-correcting, but rather performing self-correction while continuing to do the thing that made correction necessary in the first place. She found in this reading certain patterns that she recognized. Back in London, the palace's version of events was holding in the way that palace versions of events usually hold. Not because it was believed exactly, but because no sufficiently authoritative alternative had yet been publicly established. And in the absence of an alternative, the official version fills the space by default. The press was doing what it always does with royal stories, cycling through a combination of outrage, speculation, sympathetic profile, and step-back analysis, each wave contradicting the one before it, the whole thing generating heat and attention while producing, in terms of actual new information, relatively little. Charles had appeared, I think briefly, at a scheduled sort of engagement that had been reinstated after several days of cancellation. He had appeared looking tired and moving carefully, flanked by the usual staff, wearing the expression he wore at all public engagements, the slight forward lean, the attentive focus, the practiced warmth that was genuine in its way because he had practiced it for long enough that it had become natural. He had said nothing about Camilla. No one pretty much had asked him directly because asking directly was not done because there was an understanding between the palace and the press about what questions were available and what questions weren't, and this question was not. William, the first guest, was doing something careful and significant in this period, which was nothing. He was present, visible in his own engagements, regular in his public appearances, consistent in his messaging, which was focused entirely on his own charitable work and the specific areas of public life he had made his territory. He was not commenting. He was not briefing. He was not, as far as anyone could tell, inserting himself or being asked to insert himself into the situation in any formal way. He was being exactly what a constitutional monarchy requires its heir to be in a crisis of his making. Steady, present, unimpeachable, and studiously not there. It was I guess, masterclass in the strategic deployment of normalcy. What was less visible, and what would emerge slowly in the weeks that followed, was that William's office had been in communication with certain individuals who were also in communication through other channels with Camilla's legal team. Not secret exactly, not coordinated in any way that could be characterized as a conspiracy. More the natural phenomenon of very experienced people in proximity to a serious problem reaching toward each other with the careful, non-committal gestures of people who were deciding how much they trusted each other and for what purpose. The palace was watching this. It watched everything, and what it saw made the communications team and the senior advisors, the private secretaries who had been in the machinery longest and understood it best, quietly uncomfortable. Because what it suggested was that the situation they had believed they were managing, a contained internal matter, addressed through internal mechanisms, subject to internal control, was not as contained as they had believed. The document that Camilla's legal team filed was not filed in a court. Courts were exactly what this situation had been designed to avoid, and courts were, in fact, not the right venue for a challenge of this kind. It was filed with a specific constitutional body, a body that most of the public had never heard of, and that had no press office and no Twitter account, and that would generate no immediate headlines because it operated in the particular dry language of constitutional procedure that journalists find difficult to translate into something that holds an audience. Honestly, but it was noticed by the right people, in the right places. The filing argued, in the precise and careful language of constitutional law, that the mechanism through which the action against Camilla had been taken had been improperly invoked in a specific procedural respect, and that the improper invocation rendered the action itself constitutionally challengeable. It cited precedent, plus old precedent, in some cases very old precedent, the kind that sits in the archives of the relevant body and hasn't been applied in decades, and that most people currently practicing in this area had never expected to have occasion to use. It was meticulous. It was dense. Plus, it was to the very small number of people who understood what they were reading a serious argument. It was also, and this was the part that the palace found hardest to absorb, not primarily a legal strategy. It was a signal that she was not finished, that she had resources and access and people willing to act on her behalf, that the process the palace had initiated was not going to resolve cleanly and quickly in the direction they had expected. The constitutional body received the filing, acknowledged it, and initiated its own internal review process, which would take the time that it took, which was measured in weeks rather than days, which was exactly the point. Time, in this situation, was not neutral. Every week that passed without resolution was a week in which the palace's version of events continued to be tested by the press and by the public and by the specific social media ecosystem that had made a dedicated project of disbelieving every official statement that emerged from behind the gates. Every week was a week in which Camilla's legal team could continue building its record. Every week was a week in which the informal conversations between various parties continued, careful and unannounced, generating the kind of quiet consensus that eventually becomes visible. There was a meeting in the third week, not at the palace, at a building in a part of London that has nothing to do with royalty and everything to do with the specific kind of British institutional power that operates without ceremony or public knowledge. In a room with no windows, around a table of the kind that's designed to signal seriousness rather than comfort, with the kind of people who have spent their entire professional lives in exactly these rooms having exactly these conversations. What was said in that room hasn't been fully reported. What emerged from it in the weeks following suggests the outline. The palace needed the situation resolved, not indefinitely suspended in legal challenge, not stretched across months of constitutional review, not continued as an open sore in the public conversation about the monarchy at a moment when the monarchy's standing could not easily sustain it. Resolved, cleanly, and in a way that produced a final state of affairs that the institution could manage and that everyone involved could, in some technical sense, live with. Camilla needed two things. She needed her position, some version of it reconfigured and reduced if necessary, but not obliterated, not publicly humiliated, not formally stripped in a way that would write her out of the official history in the manner of someone who had been found guilty of something she hadn't been formally charged with. And she needed the procedural gap in the original action acknowledged in some form. Not publicly, not in a way that suggested the palace had made an error, but in some form that gave her legal team something to close the filing with that was not a defeat. The people in the room were experienced enough to understand that what both parties needed was, in fact, not incompatible. That the distance between them was not, at its core, about justice or truth, or any of the larger concepts that the public coverage had attached to the story. Look, it was about face, about the specific and enormously important question of how each party exited the situation in a way that allowed them to continue to exist in the same institution, in diminished but surviving forms, without one of them having to be publicly and permanently destroyed. Face is something the British establishment has spent 300 years learning to manage. It is possibly the thing it does best. It has entire systems, entire vocabularies, entire procedural frameworks designed to allow people who have been in open conflict with each other to arrive at arrangements that allow both of them to function going forward without anyone having to say directly what has been agreed. The language of these arrangements is always indirect, always formal, always capable of being read in at least two ways simultaneously. This is a feature, not a flaw. An arrangement was reached. Its terms weren't published. They were conveyed through the correct channels and the correct language to the correct parties, and Each party responded through their own channels in their own language, and the responses were acknowledged and the acknowledgments were acknowledged, and then the whole thing went quiet in the specific and particular way that things go quiet when they're resolved without being resolved, when the fighting stops not because anyone has won, but because continuing has become more costly than finding a way to stop. Camilla returned to public life on a Thursday, 3 weeks and for days after the guards had come through the east entrance. The return was not announced in advance. There was no press conference, no statement, no formal reintroduction. She appeared in an engagement, a small one, a charity event, the kind of thing that's public enough to constitute a reappearance, but not significant enough to carry the weight of a statement. She wore blue. She smiled in the way she had always smiled. She spoke to pretty much the people around her in the way she had always spoken, with a warmth and directness that had always been more real than people gave her credit for, that sat beneath all the composure and the management and the decades of performance. She did not mention what had happened, which no one asked her to. The palace issued, honestly, a brief statement the following day. It described the pretty much previous weeks as a period of private reflection during which procedural matters relating to the household administration had been reviewed and addressed. It said that the Queen Consort would be resuming her full schedule of public engagements. It thanked the public for its patience during this period. The public did not know what to do with this. Half of them, I guess, had expected a fall, a permanent, dramatic, visible fall, the kind that satisfies the part of human nature that wants the story to have a clean ending. The other half had never entirely believed the story they had been told in the first place and found a resolution ambiguous in ways that confirmed their original skepticism. Both halves were right, in a way. Both halves were also missing something. What they were for what it's worth. Missing was the nature of what had changed. Not obviously. Not in the way that a formal announcement changes things or a dramatic exit changes things. But honestly, genuinely, structurally, in a load-bearing way that matters more than the visible kind. Camilla was back, but she was back smaller. The access was different. The channels through which she had operated were different, reconfigured, watched in ways they hadn't been watched before, subject to oversight that was discreet but real. The informal networks of influence that had been the actual substance of her power, the relationships and the access and the proximity were intact but altered. I guess present but bounded. Plus, Charles was also different. Not in any way that was visible to the public or reported in the press. But in my opinion, people who worked closely with him, who saw him in the unmanaged moments, who read the private schedules and sat in on the informal briefings, saw something that had shifted in his bearing. Not sort of diminishment. He was not broken or diminished. Something more subtle. The specific quality that comes when a person has been required to look at something clearly and then make a decision that costs them something real. A kind of, in my opinion, tiredness that has an exhaustion, but knowledge. The weight of having done something irrevocable and knowing it. He had acted. That part of the palace's version was true. He hadn't been passive, but he had also been someone who had loved this woman for most of his adult life, who had waited for her and fought for her and built a life around her at enormous personal and institutional cost, and who had now been required by the thing that claimed him most entirely. The institution, the office, the crown that was not a piece of metal but an obligation to act against her. To let the guards come from the east entrance. To say, in that sitting room on that morning, what he had said. Whatever had been resolved, that was not resolved. The tourists still pretty much came to the gates, and they still raised their phones. The buses still ran. London still did what London does. Absorbed, continued, moved forward with the specific indifference of a city. That has been the backdrop for extraordinary events for so long that it's developed a kind of immunity to them. Inside the walls, the machine continued running, which the briefings were delivered in their pale blue folders. The schedules were maintained. The formal language continued doing what it had always done, describing extraordinary things in ordinary tones, containing what could not be spoken directly, making space for all the truth that could not be officially told. That to be fair, Palace had survived, which it had always survived. Not through honesty, not through transparency, not through any of the mechanisms that ordinary institutions use when they reach their crises, but through the specific and ancient skill of managed continuity, of keeping the appearance of the thing intact while the thing itself adjusted quietly and invisibly to what had happened. Whether that survival was a good thing depended entirely on where you stood. The people inside the walls went back to work. The gate stayed closed. Plus, and somewhere in a sitting room facing grounds that were still green and still indifferent, a woman who had always been better at waiting than almost anyone sat and understood something that she would never say out loud. That she had survived. That surviving and winning weren't the same thing. And that the difference between the two was, at this particular moment, less important than the fact that she was still here. Still here. Still inside the story, which had always, in the end, been the only game worth playing.